This is Jennifer Eshador's quilt, and she's made 2 quilts for the Migrant Quilt Project. And she used skulls to show and reflect the loss of lives in the Tucson sector. But what's really fascinating about this quilt is that in the images she also documents the cause of death. And we get this information from the Pima County Medical Examiner's Office. And here you'll see an 18-year-old Armand Carmona Hernandez, whose cause of death was drowning. There was a hanging. There's been 2 murders, gunshot victims in the Tucson sector that year. Here is some ice crystals on the heads of some of these people here who died of hypothermia. And then, of course, around the sun, you'll see many migrants who die. Typically, what we call the dying season in the Tucson sector, and that's the summertime when temperatures will rise up to 120 degrees out there in the desert. The hammers represent motor vehicle accidents or blunt force trauma injuries, and we see a lot of blunt force trauma injuries in the Tucson sector when groups of migrants may get in a vehicle and then try to outrun Border Patrol agents. The next quilt, if you want to move on to the next one. This one at the top was a woman, Laurel, who worked on this quilt, Laurel Wilson, and her next door neighbor's dog brought home a skull in its mouth. And this is a true story. And so we see that in these real rural areas outside of Tucson where animals will bring back bones or things like that. And I did confirm the story with a medical examiner's office. And they say oftentimes, not often, but sometimes they will see this happen. And this quilt was made predominantly from people in the Arizona community and beyond. I would send them a square or meet them, and they would take a quilt square, and I would appoint them a name, and then they would inscribe it on there. So to organize this quilt was very, very difficult because so many hands were on it. So I just decided to make these. They're approximately 12-inch by 12-inch, up to maybe 14-inch squares to represent the quilt structure. Here, down here, I wrote this, and I created this panel. Below millions of twinkling stars against the velvet black dome and along the dusty Devil's Highway, people are driven into the darkness where they wake from the American dream to find themselves among white bones beneath towering saguaros. And this is the harsh reality of migration.
How do you conceptualize a quilt when you get everything? Do you put it on a place or do you just start working?
You know, to conceptualize this quilt was awfully difficult. We had tried numerous things. We tried pinning, my friend Diana and I assembled it. Diana Ricks, who lives in Tucson. She was part of the quilt making process. We initially just started pinning these little names and squares onto the canvas, and that was not going so well. And so then we decided to put them on squares, and then we realized all of the squares were inconsistent in size. And so then we had to go back and create almost exact sizes, but there's some imperfection, as you can see. And so then that's what we did. We tacked down and made designs, and I mostly focused on scenes. So I worked on this one, I worked on this one, I worked on that one, and then this one, and then the rest we just sort of pieced together with the names. And then this is a fabric material from Guatemala, and we do see that in the desert, although that piece did not come from the desert. But all the jean material that you see on this quilt did come from the Tucson sector area.
Who did the quilting? I can't remember.
Mary Vanacki.
Oh, she,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah, Mary Vanacki did this wonderful
She's
quilting.
the one that made this quilt behind us.
Yeah, and we can talk about that one as, Peggy, you want to talk about Mary Vanacki's quilt?
Mary Vanecki is a fair, in Arizona and actually beyond. She's a fairly well-known textile artist. And I had seen her at the Tucson Quilters Guild exhibit. They do an annual show. And she had a booth and was sharing photographs of her work. And she happened to have one that dealt with the immigration crisis. And I think it was called Grandma Reads the News. And it was a depiction of an older woman, a Mexican woman, learning, reading something about, what the problems on the border. And I can't remember if it was specifically about a death, so I don't want to say that. Anyway, when I saw that, it was at a time when we were recruiting people to make quilts. And I think it was when you were in Utah. And so I asked her if she would be interested in making a quilt, and she was. So this one, it has a lot of innovative features that you don't see on some of the others. For one thing, she used this transparent synthetic fabric to create a silhouette of the Father Kino statue, which is very high up on display at one of the major intersections in Tucson. And Father Kino was the priest who came and who was an evangelist in the Southwest, in what is now southern Arizona and northern New Mexico, and he founded several missions. So Mary wanted to put Father Kino on because it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, but she says, he was Tucson's first border crosser. And so she has that silhouette of him. And that fabric, being a synthetic, is something that when you burn it, it melts. And so she used that same fabric on the lettering that's at the bottom of the quilt. And then another thing that's interesting about this is this quilt is actually in two pieces, but it's connected with this textile art technique where she stitched back and forth, and she used a kind of a fuzzy thread as well to connect it. So I thought that was kind of a neat thing she did. The rays of the sun, Virgin of Guadalupe is like a sun, and the rays coming out of it are all cut from migrant pants. And on them she put the names of the people, or the desconocido. Virgin of Guadalupe is very important too. In Mexico, she's the patroness of the country, but also migrants often carry her image, believing that she will protect them on their journeys. And then on the bottom of the quilt, she put the back of a pair of jeans with the pockets, and coming out of the pockets are some items that she found, the money she found in some of the, like inside the waistbands of a couple of pairs of jeans. When she was cutting them apart, she found that money. And then this is part of a bandana that I had given her to work with. But and then she also this is her label for the quilt. We ask everybody to make a label, and it's usually on the back of the quilt. In this case, it's on the front, and so she also acknowledged a young intern who worked with her. Her name was Julia Moore. So, and she put statistics of the migrants who died for this year that she documented on this pocket. So it says, I'm going to go ahead and touch it, 144 deaths. The ages were from 18 to 51, 10 women, 128 men. 6 unknown, whether they're men or women. 3 of them were teenagers. And then 400 pesos, she wrote $20, about $20 US in value. So that's Mary Vanecki. She's been a big help to us with the project. She's helped quilt and repair some of the quilts that needed work done. She has a large long arm quilting machine, and a big studio, so she has the space and the equipment to help us. And I don't know what we would do without her. She's been great. And she journeyed with Jody to Michigan for the exhibit that was in Michigan this summer, and the two of them presented at that exhibit.
That's how we heard of
The
it.
Grand Haven.
Yeah.
So I didn't go to Michigan, but Mary was nearby in Chicago, and she offered to go.
This one is one of the most powerful quilts. Can you explain this? The concept behind it?
Yeah, well, this isn't the tears one though. They're both on either side. Both of these are, to me, the most gut-wrenching ones. And what I responded to on this one is I actually have that desert fabric in my quilt stash, my fabric stash. It's a fabric that you can buy at quilt stores, and I talked about this yesterday, but it's kind of like the Chamber of Commerce view of Arizona. You know, what you would see in a magazine trying to get you to come to Arizona. Here's our beautiful landscape and our beautiful sunset. And it's actually, where I live, you can see the sunset from my front porch. It's actually kind of like the view I see from my own house. But here she's used it as a setting for people dying. And she put on, you know, all these little, sometimes they're called worry dolls. These little dolls, I believe they come from South America, from Peru. And so she's used them to create a family, you know, with children and parents. And then she used these other beads from Central and South America that are skeletons and coffins. I had never seen coffin beads. Never had seen anything like that. And then here, skull beads, and then milagros. And milagro means miracle. And those represent prayers, and you often see them. Probably you have seen them if you've ever traveled in the Southwest or Mexico. They're usually pinned to the clothing of a statue of a saint. In Tucson at our San Javier mission, there is a lying down St. Francis it's in like a glass coffin, but it's open, and he has a purple blanket over him, and people go to the mission and they kneel down in front of Francis and they pin milagros on to represent something they're praying for. Sometimes it's also in Thanksgiving for a prayer that was answered, and they call that a manda, when you pray for something, and then when your prayer is answered, you do what you agreed to do if that prayer was answered. But this was her second quilt. She had made the one behind us initially, and she just had so much energy and passion for this process project of ours, that she wasn't done speaking, right? I mean, she wanted to say more. Yeah. And so she created this one. And there's a rosary on it. This is, again, I'm pretty sure this is from South America, but I'm not 100% sure. And this represents the people who died in 2001, 2002, which is indicated here, and above as well. But she just covered this with beads, and she wanted to use beads from Central America because that's where a lot of people come from. We know a lot of the migrants who come over the border are from Mexico, but a lot of them are from Central America as well.
And on this fabric, this was found in
That's
the
her.
desert?
No. This has a lot of quilting fabric that you can buy in a quilt store. The denim is migrant clothing, and then you can see the denim also in the windows that she created. So she had a lot of fabric that was either Mexican themed or Southwest themed. I own this fabric, this Virgin of Guadalupe. I collect a lot of the same fabric that she does. But she obviously really likes to work with the landscape motif because she did it in both of her quilts. And it beautifully represents what this is all about, what this project is all about, that these are people who are being found in our beautiful desert. And you think about going out and hiking in our beautiful desert and coming across bodies. That's not right. That's wrong. So she lives in an area where she can go out and hike near her home and find things that have been left behind by migrants. She lives in Green Valley, which is closer to the border than Tucson, about halfway between Tucson and the border.
So when you find all these pieces of fabric, what do you do? Or jeans or stuff, you sort of store them?
You would
and
talk
then
about it, yeah.
Yeah, you know, some of the material is so dirty being out in the desert for such a long period of time that I'll just take it to a car wash and people just stare at me like, what is she doing? I'm spraying down the clothing that's just drenched in mud, and I take that home after I've done that and I wash them thoroughly. And some of the materials will just break down in the washing machine, and so other materials retain structure. So I typically use that material, which usually are jeans, cotton shirts, things like that, hats, the bordados, which are embroidered items that we find in the desert. But now, almost everyone is wearing camouflage clothes made of nylon, and that fabric is not great to work with. It's great material for them to...
Stretchy.
Yeah, it's just really stretchy, and it's great for them because they camouflage better at night, because there's a lot of ultraviolet rays and helicopter lights, stadium lights, different things that can really detect heat sensors, that can detect migrants crossing in the desert. And so whatever they can do to help diminish the risk of getting caught by Border Patrol, they use that. And so now we're seeing a lot of that, that camouflage material. And hopefully, we'll find some talented quilters that can make something of it.
We're using a little bit of it in the new quilt that's
Yeah.
being made.
Yeah. This one is also from Cornelia Bailey. And we love this quilt for many reasons. But Cornelia was working and stitching the names of the quilt onto here. And she was weeping. She started weeping with recognizing all the names and the lost bodies, lost lives, lost loves that she recognized as being very, very poignant and sad. And she started weeping, and the thread started to run. And when the thread started to run, at first she was kind of concerned, and then she decided, no, this is really how I feel about migration. And so she dampened some of the thread here, and you could see that it was able to run like her tears. And then she says up here, con nuestras lagrimas, and that means with our tears. And down here she wrote, and this always breaks my heart, did you see a bird the day you died? Were you hot, thirsty, and frightened? And that just captures the sheer loneliness and desperation of people who are out there left behind. And it's just so bewildering for me. And I guess that's what keeps me going, is that this project is about them and their voices and getting their names out there and getting their cause of deaths out there in the public so that we can humanize these individuals. I mean, we need to understand that these people who are on these quilts had families, had loved ones, esposas, esposos, nieces and nephews and grandmothers and grandfathers and mothers and fathers and cousins and on, that these are real human lives. And there's been over 3,200 people who have died in the Tucson sector, and that is a humanitarian crisis. That is absurd. That's obscene. And just this year we saw 122 people die in the Tucson sector. On average, it's about 150. And approximately 80 people who were on this last year's 2017-2018 quilt are unidentified. Yeah. I mean,
there aren't very many names.
There was no way to identify the bodies. Sometimes they're found in just skeletal remains because they've been out in the desert for such a long time. And these people are also crossing in more and more remote areas where it is difficult to find their bodies, and it's difficult to find them, to give them help, not to cross the border, but to sustain life by providing them with water, food, and medical aid.
Can I make a comment about the landscape on this one?
Oh, yeah, please.
One of the things I really responded to on this one is how she embellished the landscape fabric. This is like an upholstery fabric that might be put on a sofa or an armchair. And she accentuated the saguaro cactus, but she put the sun over here and the moon and stars over here, and it evokes the sense of days and nights passing as they're walking through the desert. And then she used crucifixes to create a cemetery. And then again, Guadalupe, in the middle of it all. But a couple of years ago, I went over to Portugal and Spain, and I walked part of the Camino de Santiago. And to me, there's this irony between what I did as a person who is free and is not, in any way encumbered. I could go over and do this spiritual quest, basically. But the migrants who are coming over the border into Arizona have walked many, many more miles than I did, and they're wearing themselves out physically, and some of them are dying, and it's a completely different kind of pilgrimage, if you want to call it. It's not really a pilgrimage, but they are also walking to something. And so that whole part of it, this idea of days and nights passing and being on this trail, endlessly walking, just really strikes me with this one in particular.
Calls from a family member from Latin America, they will send them a DNA kit, and they do DNA at the medical examiner's office, and they try to match. But sometimes people are there's very little remains, they might find a skull or a femur bone or things like that, and there's just really hardly nothing to identify. It's easier to identify a fully fleshed human being because there's tattoos and, there's moles and things like that. So
also
it's much
things
easier.
like jewelry. Sometimes they have jewelry, or they
Yeah,
have an
jewelry.
ID on them,
Yeah, many times they will
or
carry
they have
an ID.
somebody's phone number written down.
Yeah, and they do write down phone numbers in the back of their pant material in the band. Sometimes we find phone numbers. They do cut open a little slice in there and carry their money, so that if they're robbed in the desert on their way, it's difficult for someone to find that money. Yeah, so we have found quite a few pesos in pants, and
Have you seen
Yeah,
it?
this one, there's the money right here, and she
Yeah.
had found that in
Pair
the
of
pants when she was taking them apart.
yeah. It's nothing like I've ever seen in my life. I mean, I can't compare this to anything, just because it's like this really incomprehensible cat and mouse game out there in the desert where, if you can make it across, you might be rewarded with a job. But if you get caught, you're criminalized immediately. You have to register as a misdemeanor. Sometimes even many of them are held in detention centers for 3 to 6 months, and then they're returned. If they come back again and caught, they're a felony, and then they serve a very lengthy prison sentence, and so it's just horrific.
In one of those for-profit prisons?
Yes.
Yep.
That the politicians support?
That's
We
right.
got 'em.
Yeah.
That's right. And I want to investigate who owns those and how many lobbyists and administrators are on the in the Trump administration. Yes, because they get federal funds every day that they keep a migrant in there, so they're getting
There's
very,
an
very
incentive
rich.
to keep people in.
Yeah, in detention. Yeah.
So there's a movie I saw, Who is Diane Cristal? Have you seen that?
No.
It is about a body that's found. It's a documentary, and etched here on the chest is Diane Cristal. And then they'll try to find it, and we have it on our canopy.
Oh, you
And I
do?
saw it at the Toledo International Film Festival a couple of years ago. Very powerful film. So it has multiple stories going on. So
Yeah.
it's a story of a family in a small village,
Yes.
and what's happening in that village. It's a story of somebody traveling the beast, and it's a story of the coroner's office and the Mexican consulate trying to identify who this person is, and how they do it. It's a very
Tell me
powerful.
the title again, please.
It's Who is Diane Cristal?
How do you spell Diane?
Dayani, and it's written on this person's chest.
Dayani.
I'll just check it on my phone.
I've
We
got
have it on
Okay,
Canopy
got it.
here,
That makes
so
sense. Cristal,
yeah, CRY or
like
CRI.
crystal, or I? CRI?
I don't know.
It
Let
would
me
be
check.
an I think. I don't know what's CRI.
STAL. Yeah,
Cristal.
yeah.
I'll check it out.
Very, very powerful
I want
film.
to see that.
It begins, in the coroner's office where they found. It begins with people, volunteers finding this body.
Yeah.
And then what happens to the body? And then we didn't know that there was a Mexican consulate was part of all these investigations, and they have
Yes.
somebody in local area.
Yeah.
and how they're trying to identify what do they look for.
Yeah.
And then it has many, many layers. And in the end, they all come together. But it's a movie when you see, you just cry towards the end. You know, it's a very powerful movie. Or at least I thought it was powerful. Yeah.
Shrine exists out in the Aravaka area in the desert where migrants will walk by, and frequently they'll leave tokens of pesos or rosaries or things that they've carried with them along the trail, and they will leave it behind at the shrine. And I think 2 years ago, some women from Santa Fe came to Tucson and did a border excursion and learned as much as possible as they could about what was happening. And they encountered the shrine out in the desert as well. And so they incorporated the shrine on this quilt. And this just makes it just so beautiful for me as a representation of what is out there in the desert. And there's a lot of shrines in the desert for the migrants. And this is just one of them. And you can see hermano, papa, abuelo, grandfather, tia, tío, aunt, uncle. These are the people who are crossing, amigos, friends. And the incorporation of this Spanish language here really represents the people who are coming across it. These are family members. These are real people with real aspirations for a better life after fleeing their impoverished conditions or violence or,
Rejoining their family on the side.
or reunification, family reunification.
Candidate at the University of Arizona in the English department, and she specifically worked in rhetoric. And she decided that she wanted to write her PhD dissertation on the Migrant Quilt Project, and came to us to talk. Jody, you were in Utah at the time, and so she came to my house, and I showed her all the quilts because they were all at my house at the time. And I asked her, well, would you like to make a quilt? And she said, oh, that would be great. She said that would be a really cool thing to do as a part of the dissertation, to actually construct one. So this is her quilt, and she made it in the shape of the map of Arizona. And then she used little cross stitches to indicate where the deaths occur. This came off of one of the maps, which you'll be able to see downstairs, actually. Showing where the people have died. And it's for the year 2002, 2003. It's a kind of a community project in some ways. People made some of the patches for her, and then she invited her friends and anybody who wanted to come over and actually write the names on the quilt. So like one day my husband and I went over and worked on it. Jody, I know, worked on it. And she put here 108 named, mapped deaths, 41 unknown. So that's Sonia's. And it was about rhetoric, and so it was about do the quilts really say basically what we want them to say? That was kind of what she was after. And she now teaches in Orlando, Florida. She is in the English department at the University in Orlando. Was there something you wanted to add?
Yeah, just that little thing on the square about tell my story.
Oh, yeah. Yo te esperaré. That means you are, but no, this part.
Oh, yeah.
Does that mean you are?
Hope, esperanza. Hope.
Yeah, it has to do with hope. Write down my story so I won't forget how I got here. Dedicated to friends and family left behind, may this quilt honor lives of migrants and the grief of their loved ones.
When did you start making the quilts?
2007 was when I started collecting the items and I came up with the idea. After I got back from Central America and Mexico, and I literally was spent emotionally, and I'm a crybaby anyway. And I felt so powerless. And when I was hiking out there in the desert, I thought there's got to be something I can do. And I thought of this idea, and really, I have to be completely honest with you, this thing has been going on for 11 years, but it wasn't until Peggy came on board that this sort of jettisoned into an actual quilt exhibit and project worthy of being shown at museums and exhibitions and things
Well,
like that.
it started when I had the idea to write a paper about the project for the American Quilt Study Group. It was coming to Arizona in 2016, and I'd never written a paper. You know, I'd written my thesis, my master's thesis, but I'd never written an academic paper, and it was coming to Arizona, and I was literally in the shower washing my hair thinking, what could I do? What could I do? Oh, the migrant quilts. So I decided that it would be really interesting for the participants who were coming to the seminar in 2016 to hear about a different side of Arizona quilt making than they might have expected. And so I proposed the paper, and they liked the idea. And so then I thought, well, we need to get them done. Let's get them done. So I got kind of motivated because I wanted to be able to write about them. And then at that seminar, we heard that the organization, American Quilt Study Group, had a grant that we might apply for. And so we then applied for and received a grant to create the traveling exhibit, and then the push was really on to let's get these up to date and get them all done. Yeah, so that's why Jody finished hers.
But, I mean, so I don't know what year that was when you came on board, but up until that time, they were slowly getting made, and they were getting shown at very small places. But because of Peggy's experience at curation, I mean, I did not have that skill set. She brings so much to this project, and I'm eternally
been
grateful
very
for
rewarding.
her. Yeah, I'm eternally grateful. So we can talk about this next one.
You can.
So every year there is a migrant conference in Sahuarita, which is south of Tucson, not very far. I don't know, 20
It's
miles.
really a suburb.
Yeah, it's really kind of a suburb of Tucson. And every year they want me to hang the quilts in the sanctuary where they have the conference, and they get speakers from all around the country to come and speak on behalf of migration. And they have panel discussions and things like that. And this particular quilt was made from a group of women from New Mexico. Surprise, surprise, we have the Zuni symbol
Zia,
here.
yeah.
And yeah, the Zia
Zia.
sun. Yeah, but they're Zunis. And so they wanted to make a quilt. And so I said, sure, please do. And so they made this really beautiful quilt. And on here on the back, the stitching, there's a spider web, there's all kinds of like animals on here on the back that you don't see on the front. And all these patches here are made from the migrant clothing found in the desert. And I gotta tell you, when they were finished with this quilt, they brought it back to the next year's Sahuarita Border Conference. Yeah. And they brought it to me, and they showed it to me, but they didn't want to give it to me. They were so happy and attached to this that they said, well, can we just, here it is, but can we have it back? And I'm like, I'm sorry, no, the agreement was you make it for the Migrant Quilt Project. If you want to take it home and exhibit it at your church for a while, because they did have it at the church, then go ahead and you can keep it for a period of time. But, oh man, they just held on to this quilt for so long, and they wanted to keep it so bad. But when I explained to them, this is for the Migrant Quilt Project, this is not for me, you know, I'm just the sort of the cultural bearer of them right now. But if they want to have it back, you know, they can. We do send quilts out frequently to exhibits and to conferences around the country. And so we're really, you know, generous with that. But man, this took a long time to get out of their hands. I like telling that story because we have another woman who recently made a quilt of all the children who have died in the Tucson sector over the last 18 years. And once she completed her quilt, she wouldn't give it to us.
Well, it's not technically a migrant quilt, though. There's no migrant clothes in it.
There's not, but she said to me in Tempe, I want to make a quilt for you, but and we talked about it and we said, well, we don't really have an opening for quilts, but then I suggested, hey, maybe you can make one of all the children who died, and then you can donate it. Well, she finished it. She loves it so much. I didn't even get my hands on it.
It's really sweet.
It's really precious. It's so precious. It's such a beautiful quilt with poetry. And, but she does sometimes send it out with our exhibits, but she manages it herself. And I think maybe she'll donate it to us once when she gets older.
Let's move to the fourth floor.
Telling these stories, and she was so excited about working on the quilt that she started making it before I even gave her anything. And so this is almost like a typical quilt that you would see on a family's bed or somewhere. And towards the end, when I finally got the fabric to her, she did incorporate some of the jean material here, but typically it's a quilt designed predominantly of fabric that she found at stores and stuff. And she made a traditional quilt, and it's lovely, and it's the 2014-2015 year, and I believe that year 137 people died, and she used the Day of the Dead theme for this quilt as well. So,
Are the names represented on that one?
the what?
Are there names represented?
Yes, you can hardly see them, but if you get up close, you can see all the names. It's in a dark red on blue or black, so
And she did it with her sewing machine, so it's a machine
embroidered.
stitch, and so it's kind of a thin stitch.
Yeah.
Yeah. The one next, the one in the middle, the 2004-2005, that's the year that had the most deaths recorded on it. It was 282, if memory serves me correctly. And so a woman who I know from Prescott, Arizona, offered to make a quilt, and she had friends in her quilting group, and so I said, well, then I'm going to give her the one that has the most names, because it's a group project, so there's more hands to get it done. And it's a big quilt to include all of those names. And they used the Day of the Dead imagery with the skulls and the little reproductions of the Posada prints on it. And they, boy, Jody gave them some gorgeous bordados to work with. Look, I mean, that peacock, is beautiful? And that huge flower, and then I'm gonna pick up the quilt. Nobody else can do this but us, right? But I wanna show you something on the back. Look at their label that they made. It had another bordado with the butterflies. But they're a group, they're part of a larger quilt group. This didn't represent the whole group. I mean, you know, we know there are so many different opinions and feelings about this subject matter. So they were kind of the rebels of their group, I think, and, you know, got together and created this, and I think it's lovely. And then, and these, this is from the Day of the Dead fabric, but it's representing something called papel picado, cut paper banners that you often see at Mexican fiestas and celebrations. Do you want to talk about this one? You want to talk about this?
Yeah, you can talk about it.
So this is the quilt that was downstairs that had all of the skulls on it. That's Jennifer Eshador. This was her first quilt. Can you see, Barb?
Yeah.
And this one, the quilts previous to this had predominantly been made with patches. So these weren't made in an order. You know, the 2000, 2001 was not first, and then these have been done sort of piecemeal. People kind of picked whatever year they wanted to, and then at the end we filled in and made sure everything got completed. But she, this was one of the earlier quilts, but she, instead of using patches, she made big panels from the jeans, cut out like legs, you know, and put these panels together, and then she cut holes in the panels and very roughly created these openings, and then she put the names of the migrants behind. Cool. And all of that was to imply more suffering, more brutality, because that's what she was trying to get across. And as Jody was saying about her other one, she picked pieces of clothing that were clearly worn and stained because she felt it contained the energy of the people who had worn them. But the thing that's also really awesome about this quilt is, and I just noticed something's not on this one. There's usually a little thing.
Oh, prayer card. Yeah.
It's clicked on that. I wonder where that went. Anyway, she has 3 intact bordados. These aren't cut up. When I made my quilt, the bordados that we received were just torn pieces of them. These are intact, and they're just kind of heart-wrenching what they say on them. This one says contigo en la distancia, which is basically with you from a distance. And if you think about these people are leaving, right? And then the red one is duerme, amor mío, sleep, my love. This one, contigo en la distancia, when I was doing research for my paper, the British Museum in London has one of these in their collection. the same one. I mean, these are like published patterns that would be, you would buy the panel already printed and then fill them in. But they have one of those in their collection, which I thought was pretty amazing. And then also this one doesn't have any writing on it, and then she used a baseball cap. She just mashed it down, put it on there with the Virgin of Guadalupe, and she completed this. And then 2 years later, she said, "I'm not done. I want to do something more." And so she made the second quilt.
And I'll talk about this map here. So when I first discovered all the contents in the desert at the campsite, while I was camping over the weekend, I came across all this clothing. I immediately went back because I was so curious, and I joined an organization called Humane Borders, and they are a 501c3. And for years, they've received $25,000 from Pima County to put water out in the desert to prevent the deaths in the desert. Anyway, Humane Borders partnered with a geographer, a GIS person, and I'm trying to remember his name. It'll come to me.
John
Chambly.
Yeah.
John Chambly. And each dot here represents a death in the desert. And so you see a lot of overlap, especially right in here. And this area right here is the Tohono O'odham Indian Reservation. Like I said earlier, there's very small populations of people. It's mountainous. It's difficult to get to. The Tohono O'odham Indian Reservation doesn't really allow humanitarian aid workers on there, but some of the Tohono O'odham peoples have become humanitarian aid workers and have gone out there and provided water and food and medical care and things like that. But it gets so dense here. I mean, there's just such a huge overlap of loss of lives. And this map is effective as of 1999 till 2016. So we know there's still even more deaths to be counted on this map.
When I looked at that, I couldn't believe how close the red dots were to the two major cities, Phoenix and Tucson. Like, they had made it basically all the way to Phoenix.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah, I know, right?
you're in a major metropolitan city.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's, I mean, it gives me the goosebumps.
But you know, if we had the facts, you know, the facts associated with those particular dots, maybe it was in the middle of August, and they had just reached the end of their.
Yeah. Yeah.
The very first quilt was made by a group. There is a picture of it in the artist statement book, but it was made by a group that didn't sew it. They glued it. They used a glue gun and glued all the pieces down, and it's starting to come apart. And so it's being repaired right now. But this was the second quilt of my friend Suzanne, who is a border and immigration activist, and Barbara knows her. Barbara,
She's an awesome lady.
yeah. Barbara was a recipient of a scholarship that Suzanne funds at the University of Arizona, and in the art department. But anyway, she invited members of our art group. There is an art group I've been in with her for a long time. She invited us to participate in making a migrant quilt, and none of us had ever heard of a migrant quilt. And as I said downstairs, if you heard me, it was not something I was even clued into, the migrant thing. I knew about migrant deaths happening. I knew all that, but it didn't touch me, you know, emotionally or in my heart at all. And I was busy with other things. So anyway, I decided to take a chance and jump in and do this. And there were three of us, and I talked about it downstairs, how we got all teary when we were dividing up the clothing. And I know a couple of you weren't there, but you know, one of the friends, Alice, who helped work on this also, as we were sorting, she picked up a little pair of one-year-old size overalls, and we all just kind of lost it. But we are all artists and work in different ways, and so we divided up the clothing and the names, and we went home and we each created our patches for the names that we had taken home with us to do in our own way. And so Suzanne is really adept at doing machine embroidery, sewing machine embroidery with text, and that's a big part of her body of work that she does, is works with text in art. And so she did these beautiful, like, this is a collar, and wrote the name, and the names are so beautiful. You know, the three there's usually the three beautiful names. It's almost like poetry, just reading the names. And so she worked that way. Alice grabbed all of these men's plaid shirts. Some of them aren't plaid, but she grabbed the shirts and then she cut windows in her pieces and then folded them open. It's kind of like a reverse applique technique. If any of you are familiar with the artwork, the molas that are made by the is it the island of San Blas off of Panama? They work in this reverse applique technique. And then I love the Virgin of Guadalupe, so I made all of my patches with a little holy card of the Virgin of Guadalupe on them. And then we came together, and I have a big design wall in my studio at home, and we pinned all of these pieces up on the wall onto a piece of canvas that was hanging on the wall, and pinned them all down, and then I just put them through my sewing machine and stitched them all down. Suzanne painted the top and puts the pieces of bordados on it, and we kept the edges nice, really raw. We wanted it like this, to be like the material we were working with and the circumstances under which they were found. And the next thing we knew, Jody sent it off to Baltimore to a seminar, and started getting shown around town, and people said, "Oh, I saw your quilt," and I went, "What?" Yeah.
Bethesda, Maryland.
Yeah.
We agreed. They got the fabric and everything in October, but because this is traveling exhibit started, when did we first send them out? In March?
Very beginning of April.
Very beginning of April. And so we needed this quilt in like 4 or 5 months. Typically I give the creator, the quilter or artist 6 months to complete it. I think that's kind of reasonable. So they had to rush this quilt. And so as soon as it was finished, we had to take it. I had to drive to Sierra Vista, which is about an hour and a half from Tucson, get it appraised by a professional quilt appraiser, and then had photographs taken. So this quilt, when we get home, will go down to Amato. We promise that they will be able to hang it for a period of time before we ship it off again next time. But they want to show the quilt during the holidays.
To their own community.
Yeah,
because
to
their
their own
community
community.
supported this.
Yeah. And so they use a lot of pockets here, you can see. And a lot of these pockets that the migrants wear, especially the women, are very decorative and beautiful. Yeah, so you can see the great embroidery. That's not embellished. This is how they came. And again, they used the patron saint.
And the thing about the hummingbird.
Oh yeah, the Virgin of Guadalupe. Oh, where is that hummingbird?
On top, above you.
Oh yeah, right here. Okay, this is a symbol of Los Vivos y los Muertes, colibri, which means hummingbird. And do you know the translation of that?
Well, just that I guess I just was reading the story. Maybe you're not familiar with it, but the reason they did the pockets is because the migrants often carry things, that they want to keep safe in their pockets. And they had heard just before they completed this and gave it to us, they heard a story about a dead hummingbird that had been found in a migrant's pocket. And the hummingbird, apparently the colibri in Spanish, is considered to be kind of a spirit between the living and the dead worlds. And so they thought that was awesome. And so at the very end, they one of the people that worked on this painted that hummingbird, and they added it.
Yeah. And this is to really reflect the journey from Mexico north. And then there's beautiful little worry dolls down here. Yeah, so they're looking forward to the return of their quilt.
For about a week or two.
Yeah,
Then
about a
we
week
have
or
to take
two.
it back again.
I like the rosary with the coyote out.
Yeah.
What?
They look like a howling coyote.
Oh, wow, I never saw that.
Oh. With his mouth here?
Yeah. His nose and his ear.
Oh, wow.
That's what I saw anyway.
He tacked it off with the Tucson Sector, and then the year and then dyed it in black. And she wanted the United States flag to be representative of where people were coming to. And this was also a blanket that I had found in the desert, and you can see that it had to really, had a lot of wear in it. And then of course the sun will attack jeans. In a month you'll see just the sun wearing on the clothing out there in the desert. And oftentimes I come across clothing and I pick it up and it just falls apart. It just does in a matter of time. It's just so hot and the sun is intense out there in the desert. And so she created this flag, and people think it's a real flag, but it's not. I mean, she incorporated, you know, these things found in the desert. But it is, it's the journey north into the United States that she wanted to capture. And this particular quilt is so fragile. Okay? You can see a big tear occurring here. Every time we would hang it, we would see more and more tears in the blanket. So it was well worn by the time I found it. So Cornelia Bailey, who created two of the quilts that we saw earlier downstairs, supported it for us. I mean, we really had to stabilize this quilt. And then, you know, we document all of our quilts through the documentation team in Arizona. And then we also label them. And so they're like really official quilts.
They're official.
They're official. And Alvaro is his name, Alvaro Asino. And he goes out and oftentimes places a cross where every single migrant dies in the Tucson Sector, and his story is amazing. And he finds bodies out there often. But he will put the name if he knows the name, or he just puts a red round dot on it that sort of coincides with the map there, the red dot. And he'll plant them at the area where people died, and they will say a prayer around that. And he usually plants 3 to 4 crosses a week. He goes out once a week and does that. This was a stretcher that was created by migrants that were coming across in the desert. And this is made out of branches. And you can see here, all these ties here are t-shirts. This one is a belt that says USA on it. And so it was constructed for a woman from Guatemala who was very, very ill and was dying. And so they constructed this stretcher gurney to carry her out of the mountain. And unfortunately, she did not make it. She did die. However, I heard that this, now I'm kind of naughty and a rebel with a cause, but I heard this stretcher was out there in the desert and that certain people were allowed to go and see it. Well, somebody took me to see it, and I thought, that stretcher does not belong out here. And so another day I went back out there with somebody else, and we took the stretcher out of the desert and we donated it to the Arizona History Museum so that it can be seen by many generations to come. And I caught a lot of flack from the other organizations, the humanitarian organizations, for a long time. They had discussions about me doing this. And I wasn't invited to those meetings because they were hotly contested with what I did. But I was able to say mea culpa. People have now been able to see the stretcher in the museum and now are really, I wouldn't say grateful or thankful, but are pleased with the outcome, that it's being shown and people now can see it. And then this is a water bottle just wrapped up in burlap. We see them wrapped up in jeans. Usually they used to hike with a white 1-gallon water bottle, but infrared and the lighting in the desert and helicopter lights would really see those bottles out there in the desert. And so now they're manufacturing dark water bottles in Mexico so that they don't reflect the light. And almost always now they're wearing, you know, these clothing made of nylon that blend right into the desert, so it's very difficult for them to be seen, and that's the whole purpose of it. And I've been hiking out in the remote areas of the desert for 13 years now. I have never ever come across somebody who felt threatening to me, except for white vigilantes. And I want to make that really clear because I've come across large groups with coyotes in them, and not once did I ever feel threatened by them. And that's really, really important to know, because the rhetoric that's going on today really vilifies these people, and it's not true. I know who are coming across. I know who they are. I know their stories. And then here are some items that I found in the desert that I have included in this. This is a really interesting hat made out of burlap. And when you put it on, it's really kind of funny looking. But it must have covered someone's head. And this is a baby's backpack, child's backpack, with a little bear. That bear was inside this backpack, and the shoes were in there. So you know that little babies and children are coming across. Here's a pair of dark boots that are well worn in a backpack. And then and a lot of times there's a lot of sort of memorabilia sports team hats sold in Mexico. So when they cross, the migrants cross over, they'll leave all their belongings and they will put on like the Raiders t-shirts and a Raiders hat, so they more likely blend into what a typical person might look like in the United States. These hats, we see a lot of these hats. People wear them because they're cold. But then I also think that maybe the bajadores are the underground bad guys that sort of live between the Mexico and Arizona border, and they go out and rob. I believe they're in cahoots with the coyotes who bring them across, and oftentimes they'll come across at night and rob everyone. And that's why they put holes in their waistbands to hide their money. And they often rape the women. I have housed 10 women in my own home personally after they got out of the hospital and needed a place to stay before they could go on to the next leg of their journey, either because they were still too sick to go forward, or they were waiting for family members to make arrangements. And I've housed these migrant women up to a month in my home, fed them and took care of them and helped them. And yeah, that's also a heartbreaking story, you know, having them in my home. I mean, I loved them and I became very close friends to many of them, but difficult to say the least. And bandanas, we find a lot of bandanas, the camouflage bandanas and the black water bottles. Questions? We agreed. They got the fabric and everything in October, but because this is traveling exhibit started, when did we first send them out? In March?
Very beginning of April.
Very beginning of April. And so we needed this done in like 4 or 5 months. Typically I give the creator, the quilter or artist 6 months to complete it. I think that's kind of reasonable. So they had to rush this quilt. And so as soon as it was finished, we had to take it. I had to drive to Sierra Vista, which is about an hour and a half from Tucson, get it appraised by a professional quilt appraiser, and then had photographs taken. So this quilt, when we get home, will go down to Amado. We promise that they will be able to hang it for a period of time before we ship it off again next time. But they want to show the quilt during the holidays.
To their own community.
Yeah,
because
to
their
their own
community
community.
supported this.
Yeah. And so they use a lot of pockets here, you can see. And a lot of these pockets that the migrants wear, especially the women, are very decorative and beautiful. Yeah, so you can see the great embroidery that's not embellished. This is how they came. And again, they used the patron saint.
And the thing about the hummingbird.
Oh yeah, the Virgin of Guadalupe. Oh, where is that hummingbird?
Above you.
Oh yeah, right here. Okay, this is a symbol of Los Vivos y los Muertes, colibri, which means hummingbird. And do you know the translation of that?
Well, just that I guess I just was reading the story. Maybe you're not familiar with it, but the reason they did the pockets is because the migrants often carry things, you know, that they want to keep safe in their pockets. And they had heard, just before they completed this and gave it to us, they heard a story about a dead hummingbird that had been found in a migrant's pocket. And the hummingbird, apparently the colibri in Spanish, is considered to be kind of a spirit between the living and the dead worlds. And so they thought that was awesome. And so at the very end, they one of the people that worked on this painted that hummingbird, and they added it.
Yeah. And this is to really reflect the journey from Mexico north. And then there's beautiful little worry dolls down here. Yeah, so they're looking forward to the return of their quilt.
For about a week or two.
Yeah,
Then
about a
we
week
have
or
to take
two.
it back again.
I like the rosary with the coyote out.
Yeah.
What?
Doesn't it look like a howling coyote?
Oh, wow, I never saw that.
Oh. With his mouth here?
Yeah. His nose and his ear.
Oh.
That's what I saw anyway.
Speak about La Santa Cruz de Caravaca. Do you know anything about that?
I know nothing of that.
Oh,
no.
okay. But that's another saint.
There are folk saints too in
Yeah.
the borderlands. You know, they're not Catholic Church approved, but they are, you know, they have been attributed to performing miracles, and so there are, you know, people believe in them.
We have 2 more quilts on this floor, and then we have 6 quilts on 4th floor.
Oh, okay.